Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to next year's Development Discourse. My name is Patrick Okibo, founding partner Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency firm focused on addressing complex development challenges. And Development Discourse is our public discussion platform, which we use to seek insights and answers to some of these questions. According to Chinua Achebe, the trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. There isn't much more to add to this statement, but to say that at the heart of our development malaise is the failure of governance, essentially accountability and transparency in public affairs. However, this topic is a continuing polemic in academic and development circles. Most theoretical efforts to understand the governance challenges in Nigeria have been shaped by the UN framework that situates governance around accountability, transparency, and the divide between public and private spheres. This framing is not without opposition. Despite the global south, or indeed Nigeria, being at the center of the governance challenges, there isn't much scholarship on the subject emanating from a deep study of governance in Nigeria. This point, again, is without prejudice to the seminal work done by Professor Richard Joseph back in 1983, I think, Class, State, and Prebendal Politics in Nigeria, or Peter Eke's Colonialism and the Two Publics in Africa. But along comes Dr. Portia Roelofs with her groundbreaking work on governance. Her 2023 book, Good Governance in Nigeria, Rethinking Accountability and Transparency in the 21st Century, suggests that Nigeria has much to contribute to the understanding of the governance challenges in today's world. Portia is a lecturer in politics at King's College London. She has a first-class degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from the University of Oxford, a master's in African politics from SOAS, University of London, and a PhD from King's College London. She has held postdoctoral fellowships at the London School of Economics and Political Science and St. Anne's College, Oxford. She's a visiting professor, a visiting researcher at the University of Maiduguri and Ibadan. Portia, welcome.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. So maybe we can kick off the discussion by, having you present your book's core thesis, and then we can take the discussion from there.
Sure. Thanks so much. So just to say thank you to Next Year and Development Discourses for hosting me. This is a really exciting event for me because it's the first time I'm presenting my book to a mostly Nigeria-based audience. So I'm really happy to be here. And so just to say, initially my book was going to be titled What Nigeria Can Teach Us About Good Governance. And I'd tell people that and they'd say, is that not an oxymoron? And I'd say, I don't think it's an oxymoron, but it is a provocation. So in my work, I'm not necessarily saying that everything is fantastic in Nigeria. Obviously, there are widely documented problems. But what I'm saying is there are nonetheless still lessons that we can learn, and there are still things that Nigerian voters and politicians do well that we can potentially learn from. And so in my book, I basically tell three main stories. And so I'll just kind of present them today. The first is an empirical story. And it's probably an empirical story that many of the people listening are really familiar with. And so it looks at the emergence and the evolution of the Lagos model in Lagos State in 1999, and then its progressive expansion to the rest of kind of Southwest Nigeria. And in the book, I look at it up until just after the kind of 2015 election. And so this is a story that you guys may know, but in 1999, we have the return to democracy. There's huge aspirations around what democratic government might deliver. And yet in Lagos State, Tinubu inherits complete crisis and kind of urban decay. One of the things that stands out, for example, is Mohammed Murtala Airport is temporarily shut because they can't guarantee the safety of passengers from the plane to the terminal. And new President Obasanjo kind of gives an ultimatum saying you've got to get hold on what's going on in Lagos, otherwise the federal government is going to intervene. And then what you see over the next few years is a kind of program of transformation. Lagos State becomes a state of firsts. The most notable, perhaps, is a massive expansion in tax base and tax revenue, and the growth of IGR. Lagos ends up earning more IGR than the rest of the nation combined, and the rest of the states combined. We also see the initiation of kind of new forms of governance, so the creation of new urban management agencies like LOMA, LAMATA, Kick Against Indiscipline. We also see the first public-private partnership in all of Africa is in Lagos State. So on kind of multiple fronts, we see this kind of transformative approach to governance. And not only do we see a kind of what we might think of as quite a kind of technocratic approach to kind of good governance, we see this kind of really working as a political strategy. And often people say this is a kind of genius of the Lagos model because it twins these two things together. So you have the creation of new urban management agencies is also a strategy for incorporating otherwise restive youth. So the kind of area boys who are causing all of that trouble are worked into the kind of wider state patronage. Tinubu's connection to markets. So he's able to kind of balance these two things at once. We also see the kind of establishment of the tax base and the kind of financial base, not only of Lagos State, but what becomes the APC, the All Progressives Congress, and forerunners in the Action Congress of Nigeria. So we see this as a kind of political strategy also for establishing an independent political force that can be autonomous from a PDP-held federal and central government. I think the final thing is also we see this kind of restyling of the social contract. So those big posters that said like Lagos is working, pay your taxes. So trying to inculcate a new relationship between state and society in Lagos. And this is electorally very, very successful. So you see the re-election of Tinubu in 2003, and then he kind of hands over the baton to Babatunde Fashola in 2007, who goes on to win another election again. So this is what I kind of term the Lagos model. And not only do we see it play out in Lagos, but in 2011, we see its expansion kind of bankrolled and politically driven by Tinubu himself in many ways to the rest of Southwest Nigeria. So in that 2002, so by the 2011 election, we see some variant of the Lagos model at play in about 5 out of the 6 states of the Southwest zone. Now, the book is not necessarily about the Lagos model per se, it's more about the debates that the Lagos model provoked among the Nigerian press, the politicians, and the voters on the ground. And in particular, I look at the debates that came out in around 2 kind of key elections elsewhere in the Southwest, so Ekiti State in 2014 and Oyo State in 2015. So I focus a lot on the kind of Governor Kaide Fayemi and Abiola Ajimobi and what they're doing kind of within this framework. What's interesting about these states is they're much more kind of provincial, but also more everyday cases. So Lagos is kind of an anomaly. It's the financial heart of West Africa. And in places like Oyo, we see the Lagos model playing out with its tensions thrown into much starker relief. So Oyo, for example, has their revenue about 10% that of Lagos. So a lot of the kind of contradictions or the challenges come out in much sharper relief. So I think that these are kind of interesting test cases. It's also worth noting that at the time that the Lagos model is kind of coming to the fore and offering all of these things that seem to be within the kind of the mainstream vision of good governance, there's also a lot of interest from donors. So aid donors like USAID, DFID, the World Bank. The Lagos model emerges at a perfect time for them because they're talking post-structural adjustment, they're talking about good governance and the kind of good governance agenda. And in response to the structural adjustment policies that were seen as being kind of very strongly pro-market and quite unpopular in many places, and many people would say quite unsuccessful, they say, well, good governance is something that every state can do and every government can do, no matter what your kind of policy priorities, no matter what your ideology is. There's something called good governance, which is something that kind of is the basis and can be picked up by any government that's interested. And so as Patrick was talking about, this is the accountability, the transparency, and the division between the public and private divide. And for USAID, DFID, and the World Bank, they look at Lagos and they say, stuff that we've been working for ages to try and get happening in the rest of Nigeria or at the federal level, Lagos State is leading on. So it seems to be an account of kind of homegrown good government with local ownership, which is exactly what the donors are looking for. So it's a really interesting convergence of two quite similar approaches to good governance. However, what I think we see in these kind of test case elections in the rest of Southwest Nigeria is an opportunity to speak back to those kind of wider ideas of good governance and say, what might they be missing? Because they were not the vote-winning strategies that you would expect, especially, so I'm looking at Oyo State 2015. It's one of the most highly contested elections we see in Nigeria at the time. It's a quite competitive kind of five-way competition. I rock up in Ibadan in 2015. I've been reading all of this stuff online. I'm expecting people to be singing Abiola Ajimobi's praises, and yet people say to me, he's the most unpopular governor we've ever had. And so this poses a question of what is it that that account of good governance might be missing? And so that's what I do in the book. I kind of look at what some of these main ideas are. But I think before I look at kind of what's missing, I think it's also worth thinking about that there's a kind of key similarity between the good governance agenda and the Lagos model. And I describe that as them both being focused on the epistemic conception of government, and epistemic in the sense of like knowledge, like epistemology. And they're both in different ways epistocratic, which is a claim that it's those with the knowledge who should rule. And so in the kind of World Bank version of good governance, this comes out as like technocracy. So the people who have degrees in public administration, the economists, the people who are public finance experts, they should be running government. And Tandika Kandawire describes this kind of movement, and he says it's a politics of insulation. So it's an approach to governance that says these technocrats need to be insulated and cut off from popular and societal demands that are going to waylay them or distract them from the kind of pursuit of good governance ideals. And then you kind of hold the government to account by asking, like, has it been effective? Has it delivered public goods? And then if we look at the Lagos model and its kind of root in a longer term tradition of like Yoruba progressivism, we also see a kind of technocratic or epistocratic element, but perhaps expressed in slightly different ways. And so in chapter 1 of the book, I look back at the history and I trace it back to people like Obafemi Awolowo, the Action Group, and this approach to government that's elitist and progressive. So progressive in the sense of trying to move society forward to somewhere kind of dictated by like abstract ideas of what a good society looks like. And the idea that leaders do that through their kind of elitist cultivation of knowledge, often through links to Western education or the kind of very enlightened individuals or people who have exposure to kind of other climes. So we see a meeting in the good governance agenda and the Lagos model of really strongly epistocratic, epistemic approaches to government. And so what's the kind of popular conception of good governance, or what's the other conceptions of good governance that this is maybe coming into conflict with? I would argue that there are approaches that see good governance as much more socially embedded. And so I can give 2 examples of how that plays out, and that you can reinterpret some of the key concepts of good governance in this more socially embedded way. So the first is if we think about accountability. And so when I was doing my fieldwork and I was talking to politicians and voters and market women and local government officials and journalists, and I said, okay, so like, what do you have to do to be a good leader? What do you have to do to demonstrate good governance? One of the things that came up again and again was this idea of people should be accessible. And this was interesting because it's not really a word that features in any of the theoretical discussion. It's not in any of the World Bank documents. It's not really part of the discussion about good governance as it currently stands. And so I could try to delve in to thinking about what does accessibility mean? And my kind of rendering of it is that it's about maintaining spaces for direct communication between ruler and the ruled, either face-to-face or by telephone. And so there are some questions that maybe we can delve into about, like, maybe this is a good thing because it promotes communication, but there might be the further question of, is it actually a form of accountability when you kind of meet your leader or your governor or your local government chairman in the street? Does that actually give you an opportunity for accountability? I argue it does, but I think there's probably area for debate on that. But given that people were demanding that politicians should be accessible, it's really interesting to notice that some of the standard good government approaches kind of contrast with that or conflict with it. They make people inaccessible. And through this politics of insulation or kind of cutting off the technocrats from the people, You actually see some of this play out in terms of the kind of popular discussion around people like Ajimobi. People were like, you know, you try and call him, you try and get in contact with him, and you get put through to a secretary. You can never actually talk to the governor. The office has gone to his head, or he's arrogant in some way. And this isn't my assessment. This is just me kind of thinking about what is it that people are saying. And so we have a potential kind of conflict there around socially embedded accountability versus other conceptions of it. And then I think you can also do the same for transparency. So transparency is traditionally something that we think is achieved by putting more and more data online, making budgets and documents available, maybe sharing statistics, sharing the kind of obscure meetings of like minutes of political meetings. And often what I kind of noticed is that these are quite kind of inaccessible or obscure forms of kind of transparency. And in some ways, they even raised suspicions. So politicians who were putting all of this kind of data online, people were thinking it was kind of in some ways counterproductive. And so I was interested in why that was. And so I term a phrase which I call transparency in people. And I contrast it with what I think is a kind of standard approach to transparency, which is transparency in data. And so transparency in people is the demand that social networks in which politicians are embedded should be rendered legible and transparent. And so I had a kind of, I have like a interesting example where I think this plays out in a really interesting way. And so when Buhari was president, there was an occasion when his wife, Aisha Buhari, made the statement that if there was an election tomorrow, she wouldn't vote for her husband in the election. And when she was asked why this is, she said, there are 50 people in his cabinet, 45 of them he does not know, and neither do I. And this is kind of interesting because in a lot of the discussions about transparency and good governance, we would assume that like nepotism or putting your friends in government is a bad thing. And that's what we kind of want to get rid of. And what she's saying is actually like the lack of social connection or the lack of the legibility of those social connections is what's troubling. And when I kind of probed into this in some focus groups and some interviews, what I found was that the cause of this suspicion is the idea that, well, if you don't know who your ministers are, that means they've been put there by someone else. And the kind of process by which those people have got into power is untransparent. So this is why people talk about like the cabal. And so I would argue, and I've kind of made this case for British politics as well, that we could rethink transparency as transparency in people. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great thing to have nepotism. What I'm saying is that transparency is about what information do we need to make the assessment of whether our leaders are reliable, trustworthy, and knowable. And my argument is that we need sort of social information to do that. And so that's a kind of second main contribution of the book. And then let me just move on to the kind of third story that I also tell in this book, which is what is the political implications of these different kind of approaches to good governance? If you've got the more technocratic or epistemic versus the kind of more socially embedded. And so basically what I argue is that where you have governments that emphasize one at the expense of the other, you'll always find kind of the pendulum swinging back. You'll find political entrepreneurs who are willing to stand up and offer what is being kind of neglected and not put on offer by the current government. And so my argument is that in the Lagos model, and also in a lot of kind of governance more broadly at the kind of end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, is you see a strongly epistemic approach to government and a neglect of the social domain. And this means that people are vulnerable to politicians who come up and offer an exaggerated version of socially embedded good governance. And my argument is that it's populists who tend to be the most adept at doing this. And so if we go back to the Ekiti state election in 2014, we have the incumbent is Dr. Kaide Fayemi. He's got a PhD from King's College. He's really widely regarded as like a man who's enlightened, who knows how to pursue a very technocratic agenda. And yet he loses out to Ayo Fayashe, who's the kind of populist supremo of the PDP. And some of the things I pick up on from Fayashe's campaign is they seem to be taking the idea of accessibility and then taking it to like a pantomime extreme, so a really, really exaggerated version. So something you see on his election website in the run-up is the claim that he says, what is the most common phone number in Ekiti state? It is a number of me. And if you call my number, I will pick it myself. You won't get fobbed off by a secretary, you'll be able to access me. And then a kind of rendering of accessibility at its most extreme, he says, you can speak directly into the ear of the governor. So I'm not necessarily saying that Fayose does socially embedded good governance, but he's clearly able to leverage a sense that that was lacking and to kind of offer it in an exaggerated form. And so again, in this sense, I think Nigeria has lessons for the rest of the world, because it tells us something perhaps about the origin and the persistence of populism. So in the book, I talk a bit about how Trump also plays on these ideas of kind of transparency in people. And so that's another way in which I think Nigeria can kind of lead the way and offer us concepts that help us make sense of politics more broadly. So maybe I'll leave that there for the introduction.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And I totally enjoyed reading the book. And there's a lot to unpack in the book, but I thought maybe we could start from the very top and just look at like governance, right? And the UN definition of governance. Is governance the real issue, right? And I'm framing governance around, say, corruption, right? Transparency, accountability, corruption. And if you look at countries like China, for instance, right? A lot of corruption in the system, but they've been able to pull off what is a near miracle of exiting about 1 billion people out of poverty. And the focus for them was more on meritocracy than too much of a focus on corruption. And I'm not sure if I'm framing it right, but the question is that maybe Nigeria's overt focus on corruption has taken our eyes off some of the other levers of development, and that you can still drive development even within a system that is not completely transparent or accountable. So I don't know how you respond to that argument.
I think that's a super interesting question. I think in terms of the kind of China stuff, or maybe thinking about other kind of successful developmental states in Southeast Asia, like South Korea, that's been able to achieve these like huge late development kind of leapfrogging achievements. There are people like Ha-Jin Chang who would argue that good governance is something you get at the end of the process. It's not something that you start the process with. So I don't actually talk that much about the kind of developmental state in my book, or these issues of kind of industrial policy, or how do you kind of train civil servants. What I think I can speak to is this idea of how useful is it to constantly focus debates on corruption. And so in terms of my own research journey, what I started off doing was, I was like, I want to study governance. I want to work on Nigeria. I'll go and kind of ask people about corruption. It's like the word that comes to mind when people are talking about these issues. And that's the case both of people outside of Nigeria who maybe have like a slightly caricatured impression, but also for scholars and thinkers within Nigeria as well. And what I found when I did interviews around corruption is, first of all, there's quite a set template. So I'd talk to kind of a dozen people and they'd all say roughly the same thing. And I found it wasn't necessarily very productive. People were just saying things like, you know, a fish, it rots from the head. And I was like, well, that's true. Or they'd cite the Chinua Achebe book that you mentioned at the beginning. But then it kind of just seems to be like, well, until we get like some superheroes in government, maybe there's nothing we can do about it. But also what I noticed is that in this kind of binary of corruption and good governance, by focusing on the negative, it creates a false sense of agreement. So because we can all agree that corruption is bad, it makes us think that we all agree what good governance would look like if we weren't corrupt. And actually, I think what we need to start paying much more attention to is that there are substantive and meaningful disagreements about what good governance might look like in Nigeria, especially because good governance is, at the heart of it, is a question of like, what do we want the state to do? And that's why we have democracy, because not everyone agrees on the answer to that sort of question. So I think the kind of, I think you're right to think like, can we think beyond corruption, or what could we contribute to the debate beyond just that framework of corruption?
And also it's like, let's agree that there's a corruption problem, but that maybe there's some other things we need to look at, and that by doing some of those other things, we will address corruption. And what comes to mind is, probably the trajectory that many countries go through. So if you look at the United States, New York, Chicago, back in the 1800s, very corrupt systems, but they figured out, or they kind of figured it out when people became wealthier and became less dependent on the state, right? And that in turn then solved the corruption problem to an extent. At least that's my read of it. Without an overt focus on let's address corruption, with a neglect of how do you get people wealthy enough, that they can then demand, certain things from government. And maybe that's even a good way to segue to my second question, which is, given where we are in terms of poverty, in terms of literacy rates, isn't it a fair conclusion that the populist type politicians will always beat the technocratic type, right? So a Fayose argument could always defeat a Fayemi argument. And in that case, the technocrats or the technocratic epistemology, approach to governance loses out. So what becomes the compelling argument for a politician to try to be technocratic instead of just playing it the populist way?
Yeah, so I think that raises so many interesting issues. I think my response to the kind of point about like, aren't we just consigned to having voters vote for like the populists who offer to give like stomach infrastructure?
Correct.
And this is something I really engaged with in the book, because I think the standard account of that kind of Ekiti 2014 election, but also kind of wider like face-offs between like more technocratic and more populist or more conservative leaders, has been understood that it's like a competition between different material offerings. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, the populist is offering like private goods, what economists would call private goods, but like maybe short-term benefits, so food or like a cap or some money or whatever. And then on the other hand, maybe the technocrats are offering like longer-term benefits and public goods. So I think first of all, we can like push on that of like, is that actually what they're offering? And like in Ibadan under Ajimobi, one of the critiques was the things that we're being told are public goods or long-term benefits and infrastructure. You need to look at who they're benefiting. And there was a perception that they benefited the rich, and that the kind of model of development was like, let's get in the rich investors, let's make everywhere that the investors see as middle class and kind of urban renewal as possible. And then like eventually it will trickle down to the poorest. And we know from so many countries that that is not how things work. Unless you have a really focused attention on pro-poor policies from the beginning, you just widen inequality that way. So I think there are ways that we can interrogate the technocratic claims and say, like, are the goods you're trying to deliver actually those that help the poorest? But I think in the book, the argument I make is that if we look closely, the kind of, if we take as just an example, the Fayose trade-off, it's not all about material offering, that there's a key kind of social element there that has to be understood. And so in this, I'm drawing on the work of people like Saeed Husseini, who wrote a great PhD about this at Oxford recently. Jibrin Ibrahim, so other people have talked about this as well. I'm kind of building on their analyses. But I think we don't really understand what was at stake there unless we understand the criticism of Fayemi as being inaccessible. And so some of the things that have been described in that kind of campaign is that if you're kind of haughty and you position yourself above the people, then even in the last days before the election, if you try and fix a problem by giving out some rice or some money, people will take your money and they'll vote for the other person because they feel condescended to. And also, if you think one of the things that Fayose kind of promised was like, I'm going to throw open the gates to Government House. You can come and you can access me. I won't be shut away. And one of the criticisms of Fayemi was that like he was always in Lagos. He was never in Ekiti. So I think it's a bit too much of a simplification to say that people are poor and so they vote for like the immediate material goods.
So too many questions here, but you see, So you're a governor, you want to get stuff done. You inherit a bureaucracy that has significant challenges. We don't have the kinds of capacity in the public service, increasingly even in the private service, to drive the kinds of development we need to in Nigeria. So if you're really a governor that's focused on getting work done, you bury your head, you try to get work done, then you're blamed for being inaccessible, right? On the flip side, you try to be accessible and you fall into the trap of Richard Joseph's prebendalism, or even Peter Eke's two publics. So how do you balance this? Then you say, okay, I'm going to make myself accessible. I have SAs, special advisors, PAs who can speak for me. And you say to the people, when these guys speak, they're speaking for me. They still feel you've built a wall between them, and these are the same essays that you really want to get the job done. How do you win? How do you win in this system?
Yeah, so these contradictions and tensions are definitely present. And I think what I'd say is that maybe what you're articulating in terms of so the governor who wants to get stuff done, I think we really saw that in the Lagos model, and it was talked about in terms of delivering the goods and accountability as performance. So people would commend Tinubu and Fashola and say that they're really people who've performed, and you can see it when you go around Lagos. But I think the risk there is that if you only understand accountability in that way, so you say, wait 4 years, see what we've done by the next election, and then you can cast your vote judging have we delivered in those 4 years, is that you neglect the other forms of accessibility that can be done and accountability that can be done alongside it. But also it tends to be quite a fragile or kind of brittle approach to accountability. Because if you set yourself up at saying, I'm the governor, I'm not going to listen to what you're saying, I'm going to so a quote from Ajimobi is, he says, a good governor takes people where they want to go, a great governor takes people where they need to go. So, it's this kind of, the sense that you know better than the people, and so you're going to use your kind of knowledge and your skills and your expertise to deliver. I think it's quite fragile and brittle because things then happen that throw you off course that are beyond your control. For example, something that really affected the governments in kind of 2014 was the fall in oil prices. So they suddenly had much less revenue coming in through the statutory allocation. And I think if you put all of your eggs in the basket of I'm going to perform, I'm going to be an egghead, I'm going to be a technocrat, then when times get hard, you don't have that kind of well of trust or goodwill or kind of connection to the people where you have to explain to them, there's a limit to what we're going to be able to do. And so I think it's kind of how do you, because there is going to be also a lot of sacrifices, and this was a big deal in Ibadan around urban renewal and the clearing of roadside traders. And so to kind of deliver the goods, you're asking people to accept sacrifices that sometimes they never then see the benefit of. There are traders who, they lost their livelihood and that was it. They never got to reset it up again. But how do you keep those people on side, and how do you keep a broader sense of social legitimacy? And I think to do that, you need to maintain those kind of spaces for communication, in that sense that you're a listening governor, even if sometimes you have to make trade-offs.
And I think Bola Tinubu in Lagos, was a good, perfect example for this. When he started, I think this was back in '99, everywhere you went in Lagos, you saw taxpayers' money at work and things like that. I thought that was a good way of communicating to the people, what he was trying to do. The bigger question for me probably stems from another of these similar conversations we had a few weeks ago with Stefan Decken on his book, Gambling on Development. And the core argument is that development never happens until the elite arrive at a consensus to vote on development, to drive development, right? So I go back to look at Bola Tinubu 99 to 2003, or even from 2004 to 07, to see what are the factors that led him down that path, yeah? Were these factors because he was in the opposition, he was fighting a federal government that didn't quite like him, that held on to state allocations? Were these the factors that pushed him to do well in Lagos? Or were there other reasons? And what I'm driving at is to figure out how to get the elite to agree on a consensus for development.
Yeah, so this sense of how, so I think sometimes it is sort of serendipitous. And and the circumstantial kind of context it comes together and makes it in the interest of elites to pursue developmental policies because of their like political or personal aims, I think is sometimes that's beyond their control, and you just kind of get lucky. But I think, yeah, you're asking like, how do you kind of steer that towards happening? I guess in terms of what I can kind of contribute from the book on this, one of the things I look at is in the lead up to the initial Ajimobi campaign in 2011 when he gets elected. And how is it that the kind of kingmakers of Oyo State decide that actually they're going to back this squeaky clean good governance guy? And so you see quite an interesting situation where a lot of the kind of literature or people who are talking about Nigerian politics, like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, they're really criticizing Oyo State under the leadership of a kind of informal leadership of Lamidi Adedibu for being like the worst case example of insecurity and venal government and like elites who just really seem to not care. And then what I trace is that through the Akala premiership, when he's governor before Ajimobi, he has the support of people like Abdulaziz Arishikola. So a kind of very powerful businessman, kind of Yoruba Muslim leader, who's often seen as a kingmaker. And what I kind of highlight is it's not that Ajimobi kind of beat Arishikola, it's that he got Arishikola to back him because of various institutional changes in terms of the Frank Dodd Act, the kind of more aggressive prosecutions of corruption from the US Department of Justice, a more assertive EFCC in Nigeria. It started becoming a liability for the kingmakers, or what people might call the godfathers, to have these obviously corrupt anti-developmental people in power. And so my argument is that actually sometimes you see good governance emerging even from a kind of a set of elites who previously were associated with maybe some of the more kind of excesses of bad governance.
And as I read the book, I wondered what are the limits to this, this model. I can understand the core argument of the book, politics, trying to balance between the epistemic and the socially embedded. While these compelling arguments for like a technocratic leadership to close the gap between the people and the state, the argument also raises certain questions, right? So in a smaller sphere, the socially embedded model could work, where people know each other, the levers to pull. But if you then take this model from, say, the southwest of Nigeria, right, and you bring it up to like the national level Nigeria, where there are other factors that you throw into the mix, ethnicity will creep in, religion, etc. And it's a much bigger space, to deal with. Doesn't this point kind of limit the effectiveness of this Lagos model? Or how does it play out at a much larger stage?
Yeah, so this is one of the kind of concerns I had in mind as I was finishing the book, which is this kind of question of like scope. So speaking about kind of socially embedded good governance and accessibility rather than the Lagos model, which I think is perhaps a different question. But people would say to me like, oh, I can really imagine how you could do accessibility within like a local government or a village where you can literally like trek to the chairman's office, wait in line and see them directly. But how would it work in a country of 200 million people? And so I think this is, first of all, I think it's a challenge that we see with a lot of forms of kind of democracy. So if we think of like representation and elections as key to democracy, we also see them becoming more and more kind of absurd and compromised in really large situations. So political scientists often talk about that if you were strictly rational, why would you vote? Because in a country of 200 million people, one vote isn't going to make a difference. So I think we often see a kind of struggle about at what level of kind of scale the political values apply. But second of all, I think in terms of socially embedded governance, it's not necessarily that people want to be treated well, like directly themselves by their leaders. I think that what they want is leaders who treat people well. And that can be things that might be that you see these values play out, someone being kind of an upright leader, being accessible, being responsive, being listening. And that might be in watching an interaction they have with someone else. So like on TV or in the street or something that's recorded in the newspaper. And I think we see an example of this in the recent election.
Yeah. So
a lot of the support that we see for Peter Obi, and I should say, I talk about him in the book, but this is way before he was ever running for president. And people, one of the major claims about Obi was that he was accessible. And that's not because people themselves directly had met him, though some people had. It was that they watched videos of him in the queue at the airport, or carrying his own briefcase, or sitting down and having selfies with young people. And so I think these social values, they can play out even if it's not kind of us directly ourselves who are experiencing them.
And, I agree with you. And, the example you've used kind of makes it quite cogent. But you've also pointed to another question, I had, which is voting as a tool of holding government to account, right? And I think that the lady you referenced in the book, Jennifer Rubinstein, said, you cannot hold more powerful actors accountable because they can't, the voters can't sanction these more powerful actors, right? And this point has been made over and over and over since Nigeria's transition to democracy. Every other election has been worse than the preceding one, right? So if that's the case, if elections are no longer a prudent tool through which we can hold a political elite to account, can we just pack this whole thing up and know that it's done? If not, how else do we navigate this really intensely difficult situation, right? And maybe after how you respond to this would then lead to another question of even the accountability actors like INEC, right? Or EFCC. If those cannot hold the political actors accountable, then maybe we should just turn off the light and go to bed.
Yeah. So these concerns, I think they're super widespread, right? And like a lot of people feeling really depressed after the recent elections, and people, like, I remember there's like a video on the BBC of after 2015, like people are literally dancing in the street for Buhari, and then after this election, a much more muted atmosphere. However, I want to venture some optimism, and I know maybe that's easier for me to do from London than it is from Abuja. But I think, so one of the things that people noted is that this was a more competitive election. So we had 3 strong candidates, and the worst of those strong candidates still got a fifth of the votes. And so, yes, it may end up being problematic that Tinubu's electoral mandate is quite slim, but actually I think that in many ways is a democratic sign, because it shows even with the strength of 8 years of incumbency, they still weren't able to totally dominate. And so, and also I think, one of the advances we see is that, yes, maybe INEC wasn't able to deliver on all of the things it said it would do, but we see a real strengthening of certain often youth-led civil society organizations like IAGA, who are able to kind of engage meaningfully and kind of hold INEC's feet to the fire and hold it to standard. So I think those are 2 maybe encouraging signs that, yes, the institutions of the state don't always perform well, but we are seeing a kind of growing capacity in civil society to do some of these accountability actions.
Okay, so that's interesting. And just to say to the participants, very soon we're going to open it up, and please type your questions or comments. Okay, so I was saying we have a question here, or a comment from Sydney Chukukelo. The major setback to development in the states are basically dearth or lack of supervisory institutions and the lack of credible accountability. He says that the EFCC claims the president or governors are under immunity, but there are the people preparing the documents, authorizing them and recommending for final approval, are those ones also under immunity? So the challenge is, how do we allow the government managing institutions to work? And I think that's a good segue for a question I have, which is really on the anti-corruption programs we've run in Nigeria or even across the world. One is what I consider the improper conceptualization of the problem. Most of these anti-corruption programs, including Nigeria's EFCC, see corruption as a principal agent problem, while indeed it could be a complex collective action challenge, right? So do you agree with this assertion? And if yes, how do we work around this challenge, even trying to learn or leveraging the model, that the Lagos model over?
Sure. So yeah, it sounds like there's really interesting comments from the chat that I'm sure I'll only be able to kind of speak to partially. But to kind of comment on this, how do we think about anti-corruption programs? And that traditionally they have been thought of as a kind of principal agent problem, which is essentially like you've got a principal who wants to do something and they delegate authority to do it to the agent. And then the aim is to try and make sure that what the agent does is as close as possible to what the principal wanted them to do. And so in terms of democratic accountability, kind of voters would be the principal and the agent would be the politicians. And so my critique of this kind of model, which is incredibly pervasive in terms of the kind of academic and practitioner discussions of accountability, is that it comes from the world of economics. So the kind of underlying ingredients of this theory, we're assuming that the principal and the agent are kind of economic individuals. Yeah. And we use a kind of model of like, well, they've got interests, they've got a utility function, maybe they've got welfare, and they're trying to maximize their interests. And there are certain things we miss by conceiving of the individuals involved in accountability relationships purely as economic individuals. For example, they lose any social characteristics. And so they, if you think about social sanction, so holding people to account through making them feel ashamed or showing them that they've lost social support or a withdrawal of their followership, that can't really be included in principal agent-based models because the kind of individuals in the models don't leave space for social sanctions. Whereas if you think about accessibility, what's interesting about it is it creates space for social sanction to operate. And so if you do something as a leader and then you go out the next day and you're being booed at in the street and the people who normally like cheer for you aren't cheering for you, that's a huge punishment. That's a huge kind of sense of loss. And what's interesting is that no matter how rich people are, they still want this sense of social support and kind of esteem. And so I think that maybe that's something that's been lost in our kind of principal agent assessments of accountability and anti-corruption.
Fantastic, fantastic. We've got a comment from Jared Miller and says, thank you, Dr. Roelofs. This is a fascinating discussion. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. Can you speak more to how the Lagos model challenges not just socially embedded models, but also the elite deal-making that is often detached from accountability to citizens? Was the Lagos model a challenge to elite deal-making or simply an evolution of it?
Yeah, so great question, and it may be something that I can not fully answer. So I think that the Lagos model it represented the way in which certain kind of elite interests coalesced around improving governance as kind of popularly understood. And there's kind of a lot of questions about like kind of what are the elite machinations around things like Alpha Beta and the tax consultancy, where elites were able to kind of position their personal interests such that it kind of led to developmental outcomes. I think what I would kind of my wider response would be to point to the work of people like Leila Demarest, who I think is based in Leiden at university in the Netherlands. And maybe I'll just turn my video back on, seeing as Patrick has too. And what she does is she kind of looks at the way that lawmakers allocate the funds that they have access to. And her argument is that really the people holding lawmakers to account in the Senate and the House of Reps are party chieftains. And so you see accountability, but it's kind of trapped within this kind of whole elite sphere. And so I think there are different ways of thinking about that. You could respond by saying, well, the route to democracy in Nigeria is a rejuvenation of the party system. But I think more broadly, it does point to this kind of question of when you have a really embedded, long-running set of elites who are very gerontocratic, all of these guys are like 70 plus, how do you kind of carve out a space for more meaningful accountability within that? And I think that's a wider question that I can't necessarily answer in the book.
Yeah, and it's a question that we continue to struggle with, in Nigeria. And you mentioned Yaga initially, and the efforts around, not too young to run, and trying to lower the age of people in politics. not because it's an ageist argument, but really to introduce new ideas, energy, dynamism in solving some of the challenges which some of the older guys may not even really understand. But I wanted to bring us back a little bit to the contributions your book has made to just the understanding of governance issues in Nigeria and around the world, stemming from our experiences in Nigeria. And it's to say that the arguments, back in the 80s, were that politics should be divorced from social relations, and Richard Joseph again made this strong argument and captured it as public officials who deal in prebends, right? Peter Eke situated his own discussion on the two publics, right? The civic public and the primordial. But you argue that politics can't be divorced from social relations. Rather, it needs to figure out how to work when the politician, or that it works best when the politician is connected to the people. I still struggle a little bit, especially given how interconnected our societies in Nigeria are, where when one gets a political, say for instance, a political appointment, the people say to you, you're holding the position almost in trust for our community, right? And because we have maybe entrenched in our constitution that appointments are made, for instance, the ministerial appointments, one must come from every state. At the state level, the commissioners must come from every local government. So it's almost like we've entrenched in our constitution this need to take care of your primordial public. So how do we address that, learning from this new Lagos model?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk quite extensively about my interpretation of kind of Peter Eke and his argument about the two publics. And what he says is that in the West, you have like a single public realm and then a private realm. But because of colonialism and the kind of disjuncture that took place in terms of like the colonial state and society, that in Nigeria, and he's writing in the 70s, you've got like two publics. So you've got the civic public, which he broadly defines as a kind of sphere of the state and of government, which is totally vacuous in terms of moral commitments. And people feel like they can rob from the state. And then you've got this kind of other sphere, which he calls the primordial public, which I think is an unhelpful word because primordial makes us think of like ethnicity as going back millennia and totally fixed and other kind of slightly essentialized understandings. But he says that like the primordial public is a kind of repository or the site of people's like public spirited, community minded ways of operating. And he says that it's a tragedy because people are constantly stealing from the state and stealing from government to channel resources back to that like primordial public. And so this has been probably like the most widely discussed theory within Nigerian politics. And I think it really just shows like the genius of Peter Eke's work, that it's not even a long article, it's quite a short article. And yet what he articulates is so just kind of imaginative and interesting that's captured loads of people's imaginations. So my kind of interpretation of it is that if we kind of talk about the primordial public as a social public, what I would argue is that actually people want to see a reconnection between the civic and the social publics. People want the people who, so if you've got, say, community leaders who are respectable and knowable and trustworthy and seen as being a good guy, they want to know that when you enter the state, those kind of lines of trust and respectability and virtue are going to be maintained, and that entering the state doesn't lead to a kind of severing of those connections and sense of kind of socially embedded good governance. And so I think what we see isn't tragic. It's not Nigerian voters saying, we don't care for the state, we don't care for this kind of democratically elected, like more national conception of a public good. What they're saying is that we don't want it to be totally divorced from what makes people kind of knowable and respectable in normal life. And so you also asked the question of, once we accept the role of social relations in politics, don't we just accept the kind of domination of like ethnicity or particularism or tribalism or religion or whatever? And so I actually argue that the solution to this might be more accessibility, not less. And so what we see at the moment is that people tend to be accessible to those who are their friends or their kind of age mates or people from the same village. And that means that the sort of kind of social pressure or accountability they're subject to is specifically from that group. However, if we institutionalize accessibility and we make it more broadly accepted that, you know, if you have a local government chairman, a councillor, or governor, you have the right to try and access them at some point, even if you're not from the village back home, or you're not an indigene of the state, or whatever it is, then maybe you have a kind of balancing out of those different demands, and you're subjecting politicians to broader demands from accessibility. I should say, I think this is much clearer in the UK than it is in Nigeria, where we have examples of politicians being accessible to like oligarchs or their very, very rich donors. And my argument would be, actually, we need to break open that accessibility and make them have to interact with kind of normal people from all walks of life.
And I wonder if there's some models you've seen, even in your work in Nigeria or elsewhere, on how these can be institutionalized, right? Beyond just what the civil society organizations try to do, is there something else that people, you know, can do to force or insist on their leaders being more accessible? I mean, if you take all the effort that went into the passing of the Freedom of Information Act, it hasn't quite yielded, you know, what we thought it would yield. And this is something that's steeped in law, right? You look at the work the Nigeria Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, NAITI, has been doing around just publish what you pay, publish information in the understanding that the more Nigerians know about the rot in the system, they will do something about it. It hasn't quite worked. And I think this is really about that differential in power, you know, where the elite in Nigeria are so powerful and the rest of us are so not powerful that there isn't much to hold them to account. So in some of your work, have you found any models how nations that are at the current stage of development that we're in were able to get their people more accountable?
Yeah, so I think maybe if I get onto the question of like what nations maybe have been able to do this that Nigeria could look to, if I get onto that later, because I think in terms of institutionalizing different forms of accountability, I think we can look at things that are already present in the customary or traditional politics of Nigeria and then see them as a form of accessibility. So for example, the kind of norm that like traditional leaders spend at least some of their time just sat like in court in front of their homes or wherever, and people can come and can talk to them and they're on show and they're visible. I think if we rethink that in terms of an institutionalized form of accessibility, it kind of helps showcase why that's such a long-lasting and effective kind of form. Also, something that was quite foreign to me when I first started kind of reading Nigerian newspapers and interacting in Nigerian politics was the idea of like courtesy calls. I just didn't understand why like every Nigerian newspaper, the main news would be like, so-and-so has visited so-and-so, and here are like 20 photos of them doing it. And it might just be, it may be that I still don't fully understand it, but my sense is there's something there about accessibility in showing this person had face-to-face time with these different social constituencies. And we maybe don't know what happened in those conversations, but it's a way of signifying that, you know, these leaders are connected to society in these different ways. And so in terms of kind of proposals, perhaps slightly facetiously, one of the things I recommend is anti-corruption kind of recommendations could say, well, if you're going to be elected for a constituency, you have to live there, which is quite kind of simplistic. But what I heard again and again is like a lack of accountability, a lack of transparency is when like you go to Abuja, you come back 4 years later and you ask for a vote. And so mandating saying like, you can only hold that office so long as you reside in that area makes you suddenly very, very accessible. And if everyone knows where your house is, they can go and they can like knock on your door or do whatever it is that holds you to account. So I maybe slightly facetiously, I think that might be one approach.
It's interesting that you raised that because, you know, my firm is working with one of the recently elected governors, you know, through their transition process. And earlier in the week, we had a big plenary brainstorming, and this idea came up in what is called a social contract with the people, right? And the idea is if you're going to be in local political leadership, you must live in the community that you're their chairman or their councillor or any of that. Trust that there were some pushbacks in the room, but the level of pushback will also show you that maybe we've touched onto something, that we need to develop much further. But there's a comment and a question online. It says anonymous attendee. To what extent do you think the socially embedded concept of accessibility as good governance is a low bar expectation from a citizenry that have come to not expect too much from their elected officials? And do you think that perhaps accessibility might be a starting framework that could be more developed to the so-called stronger sanctions? And I thought that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks so much for sort of really thoughtfully engaging with the ideas there. And this is a question that I've been asked a couple of times, which is, are there kind of things I suggest in terms of accessibility and transparency in people? Are they like second best options? So maybe what we'd ideally want is elections that hold people to account and people reading government budgets online and whatever. But in absence of that, maybe this is like a kind of second best option. So first of all, I think these are things that are important for maintaining democracy and political systems, no matter where you are in the world and at whatever stage of development. So one of the kind of big ideas when we tend to think about how does African democracy compare to democracy elsewhere in the world is there's this idea like maybe African democracies are less modern. And then we think about, okay, what is it that characterizes kind of modern democracy? We often think of it becoming more and more of a kind of sophisticated, abstract, technocratic system. So we might think of like the Weberian state with kind of driven by bureaucracy. In the book, I really look in detail at the ideas of Anthony Giddens and the way that he characterizes the modern state. He says it's a faceless system. So Correct. You're demanded to place your trust in things that you can't like tangibly see and that most people don't understand. So when we accept an injection from a doctor or when we get on a plane, we're trusting in the world of modernity, even though we don't know how to fly a plane ourselves and we don't really know how it works. Yeah. And so he says that modern government is also a faceless system, and that these moments where that facelessness is kind of interrupted and we get some face work, we get some like in-person human-to-human interaction. He thinks it's just like a kind of the icing on top, or maybe it's just like a superficial PR exercise. But I think it's important to realize that even within modern political systems, we're still being asked to put a huge amount of trust in individual people. So whichever country you're looking at in the world, it's still the individuals who you've elected into government. It's still a kind of human interaction that's at the heart of democracy. And so I think it's a question of kind of not neglecting the different types of good governance. And so things like accessibility or transparency in people maybe sound like pre-modern because they're not talking about impersonal anonymous government. They're not talking about government as if it's done by robots. But I think that they maintain a really important role, and that's because of the way in which they can cut through certain other forms of inequality, for example. As I said before, the kind of lack of social sanction really politicians are really kind of hurt by that. They want to avoid it under all circumstances, even when they're billionaires who seem to be able to kind of overcome all other forms of accountability.
And we don't know who you're talking about when you mentioned the billionaire. But we've got a question here from Tobe Nelly. And he goes, is it possible that the ability of Lagos State to generate resources, especially between 1999 and 2007, was more due to the ability of the state government to deploy both formal and informal coercive abilities of the state, rather than due to the organic trust developed between the state and her citizens? If yes, how would you propose that such situation be improved upon?
Sure. So thanks so much, Toba, and thanks for zooming in. So first of all, to say in the book, I'm not saying that the Lagos model is a solution. I'm saying that the Lagos model is so interesting because it enables us to have a different sort of conversation about Nigerian government than the one we standardly had about Nigerian politicians who do nothing and just scam money. So there's something that the kind of Lagos model invites us to think about. And in some ways, it's the successes of the Lagos model and the way that is still not quite enough that makes it so kind of challenging and interesting. I think this question about the kind of is it the kind of coercive capabilities of the state, I think is really interesting, because even when you look back at the kind of details of how this was deployed, even the most kind of technocratic, kind of business-minded elements were still enforced with kind of like violent coercion. So one of the recurrent tropes that you get in the newspapers during this time is that companies that did not pay tax or did not sign up to the correct kind of tax protocols were physically locked shut by the Nigerian police. And this is like and it's a very striking image. You have that kind of physical padlock keeping people out of the compound. So I think there's definitely kind of room to think about the state is still coercive, even though it has these kind of socially embedded elements. But I think in terms of the kind of longue durée of Nigerian politics, I'd say those socially embedded elements are so important because for so long the state was only coercion. Like that was all it did. If you look at Abacha, especially how the Southwest was treated under Abacha, like many people's experience of the state was merely as an unknowable, erratic, unpredictable, violent and arbitrary enterprise. And so I think in terms of development, we often think the state is there to deliver goods. But for many people, it's just this kind of bureaucratic entity, and that has to be made kind of in some ways knowable and humane and trustworthy for people to feel like it's something that they can kind of interact with.
Interesting. Let's speak a little bit about an interesting point you raised in chapter 2 of the book. You presented a summarized history of Nigeria following the evolution of our definition of corruption as a moral or economic sickness. So for years, Nigerians hoped that only a morally upright and unwavering leader could deliver the nation. And then in the last 8 years under Buhari, we may be described as a morally, who may be described as an upright and unwavering character, but has put in public glare the failure of that definition. So how do we reconceptualize corruption? Because I think that's really important for any effort in trying to address it. At the beginning of this chat, we talked about, the conceptualization as a, principal agent challenge versus a collective action. But, in your work, especially at the very local level, how should we be thinking about corruption that can help us think about how to address that challenge?
Sure. Yeah, so maybe if I kind of respond to this in like kind of from two directions. So one is there's often been this idea of corruption as kind of like an individual failing, but also an individual virtue. So the way we overcome corruption is by having like excellent individuals. And this has got a lot of traction in recent years, especially in the kind of Yoruba Southwest, the idea of having, so long as we have like an Omoluabi in power, like an excellent character who's cultivated, who's enlightened, who's, has all of these virtues, and we'll be fine. And that plays out in a different way in terms of the North and differently situated kind of cultural values and Buhari, but I think it's often a kind of an instance of the same thing. Like, so long as we get one person who's virtuous, then we'll have a good political system. And in the book, what I argue is that maybe Yoruba political thinking does have the answer to some of these questions, but it's not through the Omoluabi kind of framework. Rather than focusing on individuals, we need to be focusing more on the kind of social context. So I take this idea of Ola, so like the esteem that resides in the gaze of your followers. So it's something that's conferred upon leaders by the people around them, and it can be withdrawn when they stop doing a good job. And so I think thinking about how do you cultivate spaces where politicians are perhaps more vulnerable to the giving and taking away of social esteem from kind of well-informed and citizens who are well-informed and kind of free to express their preferences, which obviously in Nigeria, many people aren't. There's not a lot of space for dissent. But I think if we can reorient it more towards kind of systemic and social understandings of corruption rather than just individual ones. I think also in terms of the kind of structural argument, I think we need to have there needs to be more debate about what is it the state should do and what forms of accumulation do we think are useful and developmental? And then you can say, okay, well, these forms of corruption are going to be really problematic for that and they have to go. And these forms of corruption actually are kind of fine and we can live with them. I think in terms of that kind of strategizing of what like economic model is outside of the kind of scope of my book, but I think that's the sort of debate that we need to be having rather than just like, oh, how do we end corruption per se?
How has this model been received by, say, the international development agencies, the World Bank, the UN, especially as it seeks to share, maybe even redefine or, bring new thinking, to the way we understand governance? How has it been received?
Yeah, so I think I'm in many ways at the beginning of my journey of kind of sharing this book and getting people's responses to it. And if there's anyone in the audience who works for one of these organizations and would like to have a kind of a wider debate about it or would like me to come and speak to your organization, I'd be really up for that. When I have kind of presented this in those forums or kind of to more like British or like political science audiences, sometimes a response has been like, oh, well, maybe this is like the African way of doing things. And I think that's something I really want to try and sidestep and clarify that, like, I don't think that the contribution of my book is to say, oh, well, there was this way that Westerners did good governance, and here's the other way that Africans want to do it. And they're just essentially different. My argument is that actually there are things which Nigerian politicians and voters are really good at articulating and that are kind of common sense parts of the political vocabulary. And yet the West has these are kind of applicable elsewhere and in Western contexts, but we don't really have the vocabulary to talk about it. In terms of, does the World Bank think that I've created a straw man? Would they be in any way interested in interrogating this? I think that waits to be seen.
Excellent, excellent. And there's a question from Muhammad Muse. Says, good job, Dr. Portia. Since you talked about governance a lot, I was curious if you came across any areas in Nigeria with organic forms of governance. In other words, spaces where the people, the locals, govern themselves, or where and this is me adding now, but where the locals have figured out how to be the real power in terms of decision making, in terms of delivery of public goods. Versus what we have at the formal national or state levels where the elites are really the dominant force.
Yeah, so thanks so much for that question and thanks for zooming in, Mohammed. So I think in many ways, I mean, my argument in this book is that Nigerian politicians are a lot more accountable than we often give them credit for. And that's because in many, many different forums across Nigeria, voters and ordinary people are using these tools and are kind of using different like everyday forms of politics to make kind of sometimes small and modest, but to make kind of gains and hold up local politicians to account. And so I saw this in many different places across Ibadan, for example, often at a local government level where people organized collectively and were able to kind of create spaces where they had some leverage over local politicians. I think there are probably also ways that the sort of analysis that I've done, maybe for Ibadan or for the Yoruba Southwest, it would be really, really fascinating to see people, Nigerian scholars, different people asking, okay, what would this look like if we asked similar questions for my home state or for this part of Nigeria that I'm super interested in? Because there are so many rich traditions, there is so much diversity, there's so much politics going on that often we don't really see because a lot of the news reporting, especially internationally, is on that federal level. So I don't think I've got the answers, but I think it's a question that if my work can do anything, it's to create a bit of space around these kind of stereotypes and pessimism and say, yeah, there are loads of problems, but maybe there are things that we can learn from local politics. And why don't we go out there and try and find out what they are?
Interesting, interesting. And I know you've just, getting published, getting the book out there, but what else are you thinking about, since you completed the book? What else is, I know you still have to do the road shows and, the book signings and so on, but what else is, really occupying your attention at the moment?
So one of the things I'm thinking about is I'd be interested in thinking how the sort of concepts that I learned about in Nigeria could be applied to British politics or politics in Europe kind of more broadly. So I have written a little bit on that. There's something I wrote for Renewal where I say, maybe the sort of transparency we need for looking at, say, British government politics during the COVID-19 pandemic is not the transparency in data, which is really like overwhelming and difficult to get to grips with, and you basically need to be like an accountant to make sense of it. Maybe it's a more transparency in people and just finding out if this money is going to this guy and he was so-and-so's friend at university and is married to this other person who's head of the Conservative Party, whatever it is, then that's a sort of transparency we could be thinking about, and that's a kind of meaningful way in which British democracy could learn from some insights from Nigeria. Something I'm looking at is I'm interested in new forms of kind of private engagement in government, both in the UK and in Nigeria. So some interviews I'm doing at the moment are with management consultants and seeing how are they working with the government and how does that maybe shape or evolve our ideas of what the state should be or what democracy looks like.
Interesting, very interesting. And we've got a comment on the question from Richard BC. He says, I've enjoyed the discussion so far. In my undergraduate thesis, I found that cultural values, if integrated into educational curriculum in high schools, could help tackle the socially ingrained cycle of corruption in Nigeria. To what extent do you think this recommendation is effective in delivering Nigeria from its current dysfunctional governance? So they play between, culture, education as a way out of our governance challenge.
Yeah. So thanks so much for that question, Richard, and for zooming in. I think there are probably like many reasons why it would be great to like re-Africanize and bring in more like study of African cultures into education systems that are very marked by kind of colonial inheritances. However, I think I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to this idea that what we need to improve the country is more like moral education. And I think this goes back to my kind of skepticism around, is emphasizing individual moral values really the route to solving corruption? My instinct, I always feel like that's quite an unpolitical way of thinking about things. It's and actually what we need is an understanding of power. And so how is it that we perhaps could reconfigure power or create more opportunities for ordinary people to exert power over their leaders, rather than trying to train people kind of moral statements or cultural statements, even though I'm sure there are kind of very extensive philosophical and moral resources within different Nigerian cultures that would be interesting to draw on, but I'm not confident that there's the solution in the way that some people think they are.
And I've always wondered about this argument about, the moral definitions of corruption versus an operating system. And let me see if I can unpack what I mean. I think that in Nigeria today, I'm not sure that a lot of people who are engaged in corruption actually see it as a morally bankrupt activity. I think it's taken on a status of this is the way things are done, right? This is the operating system. And if that is where we are, then the moral argument may not work. And what might work is to figure out how to change the way we do things that will force a particular type of behavior without hanging on to the moral argument. And I mean, I can share a lot more on this, but I'm not the one being interviewed. So I wonder if your views on this, if you agree, disagree, and your general views on this.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right that it's not enough just to say that kind of corruption is bad. Often it's the way that things work, and that's the way that people get things done. And so I think in some ways it's slightly simplistic to think that people's interaction with the world around them and the state is always going to be done in this kind of like utopian moral register. it makes me think of the work of people like Lena Coney Hoffman, who's thought about the way that social norms are kind of reinforcing. And so one of the things that she highlights with corruption is people are driven by what they think other people are doing. And so that creates, if you were to use a kind of economics language, that creates an equilibrium where like it's really, really embedded, but it also can change really quickly. If something happens that suddenly changes people's way of thinking and they realize, oh, no one else is going to do this thing, no one else is going to pay this bribe, everyone else is going to resist whatever it is, this kind of this socially established practice, then things can change really, really quickly. And so I wonder if that's kind of what you're getting at when you're thinking about corruption more as a system.
Yes. So I have this idea that if we had like a transparency and accountability rating system, rates function over form. You know, so many of the governance programs say insist on achieving like some form targets. You know, so do you have a law? Did you fill out that form? Did you get 3 companies to bid? But those things you can circumvent, right? And those things do not really lead to a change in the way we do things, right? Versus if we were able to figure out the processes that we put in place and the government institution is rated on how it consistently uses that process. And from the continuous use of that process, then you can change culture. But what's the reward? You know, what's the reward that comes to that institution if they continue to use the process? We've got to figure it out and then scale it up to what's the reward for the government if it hits certain rating targets, right? And I said, if there's a low score, then maybe you shut the government out of the things it needs to continue to govern, i.e. access to credit markets, access to donor funds, etc., or whatever else, you know, that's important to, you know, maybe block them and their families from accessing healthcare outside Nigeria, you know, and that would force us to use those process type things that then get us to change culture. So my approach to it is, yes, it's a moral issue, but let's focus on some of the things that would change behavior. And by changing behavior, we can solve corruption. But it's a much longer conversation.
Yeah, or maybe next time it's your book that we'll be discussing, and you can elaborate this in more detail. I think one thing that comes out of what you're saying is there's definitely people often think about corruption as being like essential to Nigeria or part of a kind of essentially like Nigerian national problem. But I think increasingly there's work by people like Ricardo Suarez de Oliveira, who's at Oxford, really highlighting the role of kind of offshore and transnational links in facilitating corruption. And so there's definitely, you can definitely make life much harder for corrupt politicians. And when I use the word corrupt in this sense, I'm meaning it in the most simple sense of like scamming money. And so, yeah, you definitely can say, like, why is it that the UK has often been quite a welcoming place for money that's been laundered and for people to kind of store their assets that were ill-gotten, especially when it's so hostile to Nigerian migrants in almost every other sense. So there's definitely a kind of interaction between like Western governments, the international system, and Nigeria itself.
As we come to probably the last minute of our conversation, I want to give you the last word on this. You know, maybe there's something you want to talk about that I haven't raised, you know, maybe final thoughts.
I guess, first of all, this has been a really fascinating and enjoyable discussion. So thank you very much. And thank you to the questioners and the audience. And I feel really privileged to have someone read my book so intelligently and so critically. I think my question would be, so it might be that you read my book and you kind of disagree with the interpretation of the Lagos model, or you don't think that accessibility is the solution. But what I kind of am hoping to do with the book is to show something for the study of politics more broadly, which is that we don't need to take the kind of Western experience and the literature that's come out of it as the blueprint and say, well, Nigeria will be fixed when we can finally make it like Westminster democracy or like the UK. All apart from the problems with UK democracy at the moment, it really neglects the way in which Nigerian voters and thinkers and students and writers and politicians, that, you know, there's so much there that can be used as kind of intellectual and political resources to think outside the box and kind of start new conversations. And so if my work can be just maybe one example of how we do that, but there are many other ways of doing it as well, I'd be really happy to kind of, I hope that's a debate that opens up more in the future.
Portia, thank you so much for your time and sharing so much with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks a lot.